You've lived long enough to know that fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, a constant whisper in the back of your mind that tells you not to take the risk, not to say what you really think, not to love too deeply, not to change. You wake up, go through the motions and call it being responsible. But deep down, you know it's not responsibility. It's paralysis, disguised as logic. Fear doesn't always shout. Often it wears the mask of reason. It convinces you that staying safe is the same as living well, that avoiding pain means avoiding mistakes. But that's the first illusion. The truth is that fear doesn't protect your life. It restricts it. People often think courage is the absence of fear. They imagine a life where confidence replaces doubt and strength eliminates hesitation. Yet that's not courage at all. Real courage isn't a clean victory over fear. It's walking forward with fear still inside you. It's the moment you realize fear will always be there, but it no longer commands you. Most men wait for the feeling of safety before they move. But the paradox is this: safety only appears after you've already stepped into the unknown. The moment you act, fear loses its authority. Maybe that's what's been keeping you trapped. This quiet belief that you must first become ready. You tell yourself you'll start when you have more money, more clarity, more support, but readiness never comes. Life doesn't wait for certainty. It rewards movement. And until you move, the cage of fear remains closed, not because life locked it, but because you're still holding the key. What you call protection has slowly become your prison. If you've ever felt that you're stuck in invisible chains, that no matter how much you try, something inside always pulls you back, then this reflection is for you. Because what Alan Watts discovered, and what I'll share with you today, is that fear can be dissolved, not by fighting it, but by understanding its nature. Stay with me until the end, and you may see that what you thought was fear has always been something else entirely. Before we go deeper, take a moment to subscribe, share, and comment below, not just to help this channel grow, but to help this message reach others who, like you, might be quietly fighting a battle no one else can see. Fear is not the enemy we imagine it to be. It's not an intruder that comes from outside. It is born within us, from the mind's attempt to control what cannot be controlled. You fear the unknown because you've been taught that life should be predictable, that success means keeping everything under control. But control is an illusion, a small story we tell ourselves to hide from the immensity of existence. The truth is that life has never been under your command. The more you try to manage it, the more anxious you become. The man who tries to master the future ends up enslaved by his own expectations. Think about it. Every fear begins with a thought of, what if? What if I fail? What if they leave? What if I lose everything? But the future you fear doesn't exist yet. It's a phantom, a projection. You suffer twice, once in imagination and once in reality, if it ever happens at all. Most people live entirely in that first suffering, building prisons from possibilities. They are terrified of pain that hasn't even arrived, and in doing so, they never allow joy to visit them either. Fear, then, is not the shadow of danger, but the shadow of imagination. What's often said that we mistake life for a problem to be solved, rather than a mystery to be lived. And that's the seed of all fear. We want answers where only participation exists. When you treat life like a puzzle, fear grows with every missing piece. But when you treat it like a dance, fear dissolves into rhythm. You stop asking, what will happen to me? And begin to feel, what is happening through me? The dancer doesn't control the music, he moves with it. That's the difference between a fearful life and a free one. Notice that fear always appears when you resist the flow of what is. When you want life to behave according to your script, fear rises like a warning that you've begun to fight reality. But when you release your grip, when you allow the moment to be what it is, fear fades. Not because the danger is gone, but because you've stopped demanding that things must always go your way. To live without fear is not to conquer the storm. It is to stop pretending you can command the wind. Most men spend their lives chasing safety, believing that once they reach a certain point, enough money, enough respect, enough love, fear will finally disappear. But that day never comes. The castle of safety is built on sand, because what you're truly afraid of isn't losing those things. It's losing the illusion of control they give you. You work, you plan, you worry, thinking it will make life more predictable. Yet every plan you build is an attempt to escape the simple truth that nothing here is guaranteed. Safety is the most seductive trap the mind ever invented, because it promises peace while quietly breeding anxiety. The more you try to secure yourself, the more fragile you become. The man who builds walls around his heart believes he's protecting it, but he's only ensuring it will never feel alive again. The one who saves every moment for later ends up with a future that never arrives. The one who avoids rejection never experiences love. The pursuit of safety creates the very danger it seeks to prevent, a slow death by hesitation. Life doesn't punish you with pain, it punishes you with the absence of life itself when you refuse to risk. Alan Watts once compared human beings to people who cling to the edge of a cliff, terrified of falling, not realizing that the ground they're clinging to is crumbling. We live gripping the illusion of permanence, our job, our reputation, our youth, while life keeps whispering, "Let go." When you finally release your grip, you don't fall into chaos. You fall into truth. The ocean doesn't drown the wave that merges with it. In the same way, when you stop resisting the flow of existence, you stop being separate from it. The illusion of safety dies, but you remain freer than ever. Fear feeds on your refusal to trust. It thrives when you treat life as an enemy that must be managed. But once you understand that everything, even loss, is part of a larger rhythm, fear starves. The man who accepts uncertainty stops being a victim of it. He sees that every change, every risk, is a pulse of the same living current that brought him here. You were not meant to build a fortress. You were meant to become the ocean itself. There comes a point when a man must confront the truth that his entire life has been built around avoidance. Avoidance of loss, of failure, of embarrassment, of pain. Yet the more he avoids, the smaller his world becomes. Fear begins by protecting him from the storm, but eventually it builds the walls that block out the sun. You begin by saying, "I just need to be careful," and end up saying, "I can't." You convince yourself that control is strength, that caution is wisdom, but all the while something inside you is starving for air. Fear promises comfort, but it delivers suffocation. The problem isn't that life is too uncertain, it's that you've mistaken uncertainty for danger. When you try to manage life, you don't make it safer. You only make yourself more fragile, because you're constantly fighting what cannot be controlled. The illusion of control is born from the ego's fear of annihilation. It wants to be the author of everything, to command the tide, to negotiate with destiny. But life cannot be negotiated. It is wild, spontaneous, vast. The more you attempt to domesticate it, the more violent your suffering becomes when it refuses to obey. Watts used to say that trying to control life is like trying to grab water with your fist. The tighter you squeeze, the less you hold. When you stop grasping, when you open your hand, the water rests gently in your palm. That's how trust begins. It's not blind optimism, it's intelligent surrender. You begin to see that there's a hidden wisdom operating beneath the chaos, that even the moments of fear and failure carry a strange grace when you no longer label them as mistakes. True trust doesn't mean you stop feeling fear. It means you stop letting it dictate your movements. You still hear its voice, but it no longer makes the decisions. The fearful man prays for the world to change before he acts. The free man acts and lets the world rearrange itself afterward. He learns that fear cannot be defeated, because fear isn't an opponent, it's a teacher. It appears every time you approach a threshold that matters. It asks you one question: Do you trust life enough to keep walking? When you answer yes, not with words but with action, you begin to notice that the ground rises to meet your feet as you move. But to reach that state, you must be willing to die to the illusion of control. You must watch your old identity crumble, the one that depended on certainty, approval, and outcomes. That death feels terrifying at first. You feel naked, unsupported, exposed. But that's because for the first time, you're meeting reality without filters. And reality, despite all your fears, is not against you. It was never trying to destroy you. It was trying to wake you. Every time life removed your safety net, it was inviting you to discover that you could fly without it. Fear only has power over those who still believe they need protection from life itself. When that belief ends, the chains fall silently away, not with struggle, but with understanding. When a man begins to see through the illusion of control, something subtle but irreversible happens within him. Fear loses its status as the ruler of his mind and becomes a quiet messenger. It still appears, but instead of paralyzing him, it informs him. He understands that fear shows up precisely where life asks for his expansion. Where fear exists, there lies the edge of his growth. And so what once felt like a wall now becomes a doorway. You stop saying, "I'm afraid, therefore I should avoid it," and begin to say, "I'm afraid, therefore I must look closer." Every fear becomes a signal pointing toward your liberation. In this state, the man stops running from discomfort. He begins to meet it with curiosity. When anxiety rises, he breathes into it instead of distracting himself with noise, screens, or busyness. He listens, not to the story fear tells, but to the energy underneath it. Fear always speaks about the future, but the body only exists in the present. And when you anchor yourself in the present, fear dissolves like smoke. It cannot survive in the truth of the moment, because in this moment you are still alive. You are breathing. You are safe. The mind trembles over what could happen, but life itself only ever happens now. The man who lives this way appears strange to others. He seems calm in situations that would make most people panic. They call him detached, arrogant, or lucky. But what they don't see is the inner discipline that allows him to stand still in the storm. He doesn't need to control outcomes anymore because he trusts himself to adapt. This is real strength, not the absence of fear, but the confidence that you can face whatever comes. Once you stop trying to control life, you stop being controlled by it. People mistake this peace for coldness, but it's the warmth of someone who no longer spends his energy fighting imaginary battles. And from this freedom comes clarity. You begin to see that your fears were never about the world itself, but about losing a version of yourself that couldn't survive change. Every fear is the shadow of an identity dying. You feared rejection because you identified with being accepted. You feared failure because you identified with being successful. You feared loss because you identified with having. When these illusions fall away, what remains cannot be touched by any of it. You start living not from fear of what you might lose, but from love for what you already are. And that is the moment fear's role ends, not because you conquered it, but because you outgrew it. At some point, a man realizes that freedom was never about getting rid of fear, but about seeing through it. He understands that life is not a war to be won, but a current to be trusted. When this realization finally settles into his bones, his movements change. He stops chasing outcomes with desperate intensity. He speaks slower, listens deeper, and acts with an effortless precision that seems almost divine. Fear no longer drives him because he no longer needs the illusion of control to feel alive. He's discovered something better than control: participation. He participates fully in whatever life brings, without resistance. Like a surfer riding a wave, he knows that falling is part of the ride and that the wave was never his to begin with. This is the essence of surrender, not defeat, but cooperation with something greater than yourself. To those still trapped in the cage of fear, this man seems reckless. They wonder how he can walk away from what others cling to: security, approval, reputation. But his peace doesn't depend on what can be taken from him. When you no longer define yourself by what you own, by what others think, or by how much certainty you have, the world loses its ability to threaten you. You become untouchable, not because you've built stronger walls, but because there's nothing left to defend. That's the paradox Alan Watts loved to describe. The man who surrenders becomes invincible, precisely because he's willing to lose everything. His fear was never of loss itself, but of the self-image that thought it couldn't survive loss. When that false identity dies, there is nothing left for fear to hold on to. Surrender doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop trying to bend reality to your will. You act, you give, you love, but you don't demand guarantees. You do your part and let life do hers. And when you live this way, a quiet strength rises from within you. You begin to notice that when you stop forcing outcomes, things often unfold with more grace than your plans ever allowed. What used to feel like coincidence now feels like harmony. You realize that life isn't happening to you, it's happening through you. That's why surrender is not weakness, it's alignment. It's saying yes to existence, even when you don't understand it. The man who surrenders begins to see beauty where he once saw threat. He notices that even pain has its rhythm, even endings have their mercy. He understands that fear is not the opposite of faith, but its doorway. Each time he trusts, even when his mind screams in protest, he steps closer to the truth that he was never separate from life at all. In that intimacy, fear loses its power. You don't have to fight the darkness when you realize you were the light all along. And from that moment on, everything, the laughter, the loss, the silence, becomes a part of the same magnificent dance. When a man reaches this stage, life begins to look entirely different. What once appeared as a battlefield now feels like a vast open field where everything, joy, fear, love, pain, arises and fades in the same boundless space of awareness. You no longer chase pleasure or run from discomfort because you see that both are temporary guests. You stop asking for life to be easy and start asking to be real. That's the paradox of awakening. What once looked like isolation is actually connection. What once felt like weakness is now unshakable power. And what once seemed like loss becomes liberation. Fear no longer chains you to the shore. It becomes the wind that teaches you how to sail. From the outside, you may seem quieter, perhaps even distant. People might say you've changed, and they're right. You've stopped performing for approval. You no longer need the noise of the world to confirm your worth. Inside, however, there's a peace so deep it can't be described. It's not the peace of having everything under control, but of no longer needing to control anything at all. You live, not as a man who is constantly defending himself against life, but as one who has finally joined it. The storms still come, but now you move with them. You understand that the same force that shakes your world is the same one that breathes life into it. That's the freedom Alan Watts pointed to. A freedom that doesn't depend on changing your circumstances, but on changing your relationship with them. When you see that fear is simply the echo of your own resistance, you stop fighting shadows. You understand that fear was never your jailer, your attachment to certainty was. Letting go of that need is the greatest act of strength a man can perform, because once you release your grip on life, life finally has room to hold you. That is where living truly begins. So if this reflection has touched something in you, take a moment before you go. Subscribe, share this video, and leave a comment below. Not just as a gesture of support, but as part of your own release. Write about the fear you're ready to let go of, or the moment you learn to trust again. Your words will help another man somewhere realize he's not alone in this awakening. And that, perhaps, is how freedom spreads, one honest reflection at a time.